Picture standing in a crowded square centuries ago, surrounded by onlookers as a judge announces a sentence so harsh it makes your skin crawl. This wasn't just justice, it was a spectacle, a warning carved into the very fabric of society. Ancient legal systems often relied on punishments so extreme they'd be unthinkable today. Methods designed not just to penalize but to terrify, to control, and to send a message no one could ignore. What drove these brutal practices? How did societies justify such cruelty in the name of order? And what can these dark chapters teach us about the fragile line between justice and brutality? From the moment civilizations began codifying laws, punishments became a mirror reflecting their deepest fears and values. Some ancient judges didn't just sentence criminals, they orchestrated public nightmares, turning pain into theater. Imagine being locked in a metal bull as flames licked its belly, or forced to wear a spiked collar that made even the slightest movement agony. These weren't just punishments, they were psychological warfare, tools to ensure obedience through sheer terror. Yet buried in these grim tales is a startling truth. The evolution of justice is a story of humanity slowly learning empathy, of realizing that cruelty rarely builds a safer world. So why revisit these unsettling practices now? Because understanding where we've been shines a light on how far we've come and how easily progress can unravel. As we uncover 21 ancient punishments that would shock the modern conscience, you'll see how innovation in law once meant inventing new ways to inflict suffering. But you'll also discover how societies began questioning these methods, planting the seeds for the rights we cherish today. This journey isn't just about the past, it's a reminder that justice, at its best, must balance accountability with humanity. Ready to step into the shadows of history, what you're about to witness will challenge everything you thought you knew about crime and consequence. The Brazen Bull stands as one of history's most chilling examples of punishment as theater. Crafted from bronze and shaped like a bull, this hollow statue became a furnace for the condemned. Victims were sealed inside while flames heated the metal until it glowed, turning the chamber into an oven. But the horror didn't end there. The design included a series of tubes that distorted screams into sounds resembling a bull's roar, turning agony into grotesque entertainment for gathered crowds. This device wasn't just about inflicting pain, it was a calculated display of power. Ancient Greek rulers and judges understood the psychological impact of public spectacles. By transforming executions into performances, they reinforced a stark message. Defiance would be met with unbearable suffering, and the entire community would bear witness. What's particularly unsettling is how much thought went into the bull's design. The engineers who built it didn't just want to kill, they wanted the process to be as terrifying and memorable as possible. Yet the Brazen Bull also reveals a paradox in ancient justice systems. While these societies valued order and law, their methods often undermined trust in those very institutions. When punishment becomes too extreme, it can erode the legitimacy of the system itself. Over time, even some ancient leaders began questioning such brutality. The Roman philosopher Cicero, for instance, criticized excessive cruelty, arguing that justice should inspire respect, not just terror. The bull's legacy forces us to ask, where is the line between effective deterrence and needless barbarity? As we reflect on this device, it's worth noting how modern justice systems have moved away from such spectacles. Today, the idea of turning executions into public entertainment is unthinkable in most of the world. But the Brazen Bull's story lingers as a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when punishment prioritizes fear over fairness and spectacle over justice. Flaying alive wasn't just a punishment, it was a deliberate act of dehumanization, a ritual that reduced a person to raw flesh before an audience's eyes. In ancient Assyria and Persia, judges reserved this horror for crimes considered unforgivable, from treason to sacrilege. The process was methodical. Executioners used knives to peel skin from the body in strips, often starting with the limbs or back to prolong consciousness. Some accounts describe victims surviving for hours, forced to endure not just unimaginable pain, but the surreal terror of watching their own bodies being dismantled. What made flaying uniquely sinister was its symbolism. Unlike simple executions, this punishment carried a philosophical weight. It literally stripped away the outer layer of identity, leaving the condemned unrecognizable in their final moments. Ancient societies saw the skin as a boundary between the self and the world, so removing it was akin to erasing personhood itself. The public nature of the act amplified its impact. Crowds didn't just witness death, they saw a human being unmade, a spectacle designed to haunt the collective memory. Yet even in its brutality, flaying revealed contradictions in these civilizations. The same cultures that practiced such cruelty also produced intricate legal codes and advancements in art and science. This duality forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Progress in one area doesn't guarantee humanity in another. Some historians argue that flaying's popularity stemmed from its perceived effectiveness. In societies where written laws were still emerging, visceral demonstrations of power might have felt necessary to maintain order. Modern forensic science sheds light on the physical toll of this practice. The human body can survive surprisingly long without skin, but shock and infection would eventually lead to an agonizing end. What's harder to quantify is the psychological dimension, the deliberate infliction of existential dread alongside physical torment. Today, flaying survives only in metaphors like skinning someone alive to describe humiliation. But its legacy lingers in debates about punishment's purpose. Should justice ever seek to dismantle a person's humanity, or does that undermine the very morality it claims to uphold? As we move through these grim chapters, notice how each punishment reflects its era's values and fears. Flaying wasn't just about pain, it was a statement about power, identity, and the price of defiance. And while we've abandoned such methods, their shadows remind us how fragile the line between justice and cruelty can be. Crucifixion wasn't merely an execution method. It was a meticulously engineered system of prolonged torment, designed to break bodies and spirits in full public view. The Romans perfected this practice not just for its lethality, but for its psychological impact on witnesses. Victims, often rebels or enslaved people, were forced to carry their own crosses through jeering crowds, a ritual of humiliation before the real agony began. Once nailed or bound to the wooden beams, death came slowly, sometimes over several days, as the body's weight made each breath a struggle. The positioning of the arms and legs wasn't arbitrary. It ensured suffocation would occur only after exhaustion, dehydration, or shock had amplified the suffering to unbearable levels. What set crucifixion apart was its theatrical duality. On one hand, it served as Rome's ultimate deterrent, lining roads with broken figures to warn against defiance. On the other, it revealed a paradox in ancient justice. The same empire that built aqueducts and legal codes also considered prolonged, public dying an acceptable tool of control. Historical accounts describe how victims could linger for days, their cries attracting scavenging birds, a detail that underscores the punishment's deliberate cruelty. Yet crucifixion's effectiveness is debatable. While it terrified many, some rebels like Spartacus's followers faced it en masse, suggesting terror alone couldn't suppress desperation or dissent. The legacy of crucifixion extends far beyond its physical brutality. Its symbolism evolved over centuries, transforming from a mark of shame into a religious emblem for millions. This shift highlights how societies reinterpret justice through time. What was once a tool of state terror became, for many, a symbol of sacrifice and resilience. Modern forensic studies reveal the physiological horrors crucifixion inflicted: dislocated joints, collapsed lungs, and the searing pain of nails severing major nerves. But perhaps its most enduring lesson is how public suffering can be weaponized, not just to punish individuals, but to manipulate the collective psyche of a population. As we move from this grim practice, consider how its principles echo in subtler forms today. The idea of punishment as spectacle hasn't vanished. It's merely softened, replaced by media coverage of trials or viral shaming. The next punishment we'll examine takes humiliation in a different direction, blending physical agony with social obliteration. Where crucifixion targeted the body, the Scold's Bridle attacked identity itself, turning silence into a weapon. The Scavenger's Daughter might sound like the title of a folktale, but this Tudor-era device was anything but whimsical. While the rack stretched victims to unbearable lengths, this contraption worked in reverse, folding the body into a forced crouch with metal bands compressing the limbs tightly against the torso. The pressure didn't just cause discomfort, it crushed ribs, dislocated joints, and forced blood from the nose and ears as internal organs were squeezed beyond their limits. Named after its inventor, Sir Leonard Skevington, whose nickname was Scavenger, the device's innocuous title masked its horrifying function, a dark euphemism that softened the reality of state-sanctioned torture. What's striking about this punishment is its deceptive efficiency. Unlike the prolonged agony of crucifixion or flaying, the Scavenger's Daughter could inflict irreversible damage in minutes. Judges favored it for extracting confessions precisely because of its swift brutality. Victims who survived often suffered permanent disabilities, their spines or pelvises shattered by the compression. Yet records suggest the device wasn't just about physical coercion, it was psychological warfare. Forcing someone into a fetal position mirrored the helplessness of infancy, stripping away dignity while the body failed. The Scavenger's Daughter also reveals how technology advanced the art of suffering. Medieval torture often relied on crude implements, but this device showcased a perverse innovation, leveraging engineering principles to maximize pain. Its compact design made it portable, allowing interrogators to transport it between prisons or courtrooms. This mobility hints at how systematized judicial torture had become by the Tudor period, no longer an improvised act but a calculated process. Yet there's a grim irony here. The same era that produced Shakespeare's eloquent musings on mercy also birthed machines like this. It forces us to confront how societies compartmentalize cruelty, justifying it as necessity while celebrating progress in other realms. Today, the Scavenger's Daughter survives only in museums, a relic of a time when justice and brutality were entwined. But its legacy lingers in modern debates about coercive interrogation, how easily the line between order and oppression can blur when fear outweighs ethics. As we turn to the next punishment, consider how the natural world was weaponized in ways even machines couldn't match. Where the Scavenger's Daughter used cold metal, some judges turned to living creatures, unleashing the primal terror of being devoured alive. The horror of execution by animals wasn't just in the act itself, but in the deliberate humiliation of surrendering human dignity to beasts. Damnatio ad Bestias turned death into a macabre performance, where the roar of the crowd rivaled the snarls of starved lions. In Rome's grand amphitheaters, condemned prisoners, often slaves, Christians, or rebels, were thrust into the arena unarmed, left to face predators trained to kill slowly for maximum spectacle. The animals weren't just executioners, they were co-stars in a gruesome theater, their instincts weaponized to deliver pain with dramatic flair. Historical accounts describe how some victims were dressed as mythological figures, their suffering staged to reenact legends like Orpheus torn apart by Maenads, blurring the line between punishment and perverse artistry. This punishment's power lay in its symbolism. By pitting civilization against savagery, Rome reinforced a hierarchy. Those who defied order would be reduced to prey. The crowd's excitement wasn't incidental, it was the point. Judges understood that collective catharsis could solidify loyalty to the state, yet the practice also exposed hypocrisy. The same society that prided itself on legal sophistication reveled in watching living beings, human and animal, reduced to raw violence. Over time, Damnatio ad Bestias became a political tool. Emperors like Nero used it to target marginalized groups, turning persecution into populist entertainment. Archaeological evidence reveals the scale of this brutality. Bone fragments from amphitheaters show teeth marks matching lions and bears, while mosaics depict leopards mid-leap toward cowering victims. But perhaps the most chilling detail was the pacing. Executions weren't rushed, they were choreographed, with animals sometimes withheld from the condemned for hours to amplify terror. Modern psychologists recognize this as a form of anticipatory trauma, where dread becomes its own torture. The legacy of Damnatio ad Bestias lingers in uncomfortable ways. While we no longer stage deaths for entertainment, the allure of watching suffering persists, whether in viral videos or true crime sensationalism. As we move to the next punishment, consider how humiliation took center stage in ways even bloodshed couldn't match. Where beasts tore bodies apart, the Judas Cradle targeted the mind, weaponizing shame with surgical precision. The Judas Cradle took the simple act of sitting and transformed it into an unthinkable nightmare. Shaped like a sharpened pyramid, this wooden or metal device forced victims to straddle its point, their own body weight gradually driving the wedge deeper with each exhausted shift for relief. Unlike swift executions, this torture method played out over hours or even days, as interrogators raised and lowered the victim to control the intensity of suffering. The Spanish Inquisition favored it not just for the physical torment, but for the psychological horror of self-inflicted pain, each movement a desperate calculation between agony and survival. What made the Judas Cradle particularly sinister was its clinical precision. The design ensured damage without immediate death, targeting vulnerable areas that guaranteed maximum pain while minimizing blood loss. Historical accounts describe how victims, often accused of heresy or treason, would be suspended above the device before being slowly lowered, their fate hinging on whether they'd confess or endure further descent. The torture's duration wasn't arbitrary. It exploited the body's natural instinct to struggle, turning self-preservation into self-destruction. Beyond physical suffering, the device weaponized humiliation. Stripped naked, victims weren't just in pain, they were exposed, reduced to a state of primal vulnerability. This duality, physical and psychological torment, reveals how advanced torture had become by the medieval period. Where earlier methods relied on brute force, the Judas Cradle demonstrated a chilling understanding of human anatomy and psychology. Modern forensic analysis suggests the pain would radiate through the pelvis into the spine, creating waves of torment that left no visible marks but inflicted lasting internal trauma. Yet the Judas Cradle's legacy extends beyond its mechanics. Its existence forces us to confront how institutions justify cruelty in the name of truth or order. The Spanish Inquisition operated under the guise of religious purity, yet tools like this expose how power often corrupts moral frameworks. Today, replicas sit quietly in museums, their polished surfaces belying the screams they once elicited. But their silent presence asks uncomfortable questions. When societies believe their cause is righteous, how easily do they cross the line from justice to barbarity? Now consider how water, something essential for life, could be twisted into an instrument of torment. Where the Judas Cradle used gravity and sharp edges, the next punishment manipulated one of humanity's most primal fears, drowning, stretching the boundary between life and death into unbearable suspense. The boat's punishment turned the human body into a living tomb where victims became unwilling participants in their own gruesome decay. Persian judges devised this method for traitors, binding the condemned inside two hollowed-out boats, one serving as the base, the other clamped tightly on top, with only the head, hands, and feet protruding. Force-fed milk and honey to prolong their suffering, the prisoners would lie immobilized as their own waste attracted insects, which would eventually infest the rotting flesh. Death came not from the boats themselves, but from the slow creep of infection, starvation, or septic shock over days or even weeks, all while the victim remained fully conscious. What set this punishment apart wasn't just its brutality, but its cold calculation. The Persians understood that time itself could be weaponized. Unlike swift executions, which allowed dignity in a quick end, the boat stretched suffering into an unbearable marathon where each passing hour deepened the horror. Historical accounts describe how the mixture of milk and honey wasn't just nourishment, it induced diarrhea, accelerating the body's breakdown while drawing swarms of flies and maggots. The psychological torment was equally deliberate. Trapped in darkness, unable to move, victims could only listen as insects buzzed closer, knowing what was coming but powerless to stop it. This method also reflected a grim innovation in judicial cruelty. Ancient punishments often sought spectacle, but the boats required no audience. The terror was intimate, unfolding in isolation, making it a uniquely personal form of torture. It revealed how far societies would go to punish betrayal, not just with pain but with utter degradation. The Persians, renowned for their advancements in architecture and governance, also perfected this nightmare, proving that progress in one area doesn't guarantee humanity in another. Modern forensic science helps us grasp the physical toll. Prolonged immobilization would cause muscle atrophy and bed sores, while the buildup of toxins from infection would lead to delirium before death. But the true horror lay in the waiting. Unlike flaying or crucifixion, where pain was immediate, the boats forced victims to anticipate their fate, minute by minute. This slow unraveling of the mind and body raises unsettling questions about the limits of justice. When does punishment cease to serve order and become pure sadism? As we leave this horror behind, consider how the next punishment shifted the burden of execution onto the victim's own family, a twist that weaponized love and loyalty against the condemned. Where the boats relied on passive decay, the next method demanded active participation, turning relatives into instruments of the state's vengeance. Pona transformed justice into a grotesque parable, where the punishment mirrored the crime in the most literal and horrifying way possible. In ancient Rome, those convicted of parricide killing one's parents faced a fate designed to shock the conscience. Sewn into a leather sack alongside live animals like snakes, monkeys, and even roosters, the condemned were thrown into deep waters to drown. But this wasn't just about execution, it was a ritualistic unraveling of nature itself. The animals weren't chosen at random. Snakes symbolized treachery, monkeys mirrored the perpetrator's perceived lack of humanity, and roosters represented the betrayal of familial bonds, crowing as the sack sank beneath the waves. What made Pona color uniquely disturbing was its theatrical symbolism. Roman judges saw parricide as the ultimate violation of natural order, so the punishment had to reflect that inversion. By forcing the killer into a shared grave with creatures, the act blurred the line between human and beast, suggesting the condemned had forfeited their place in civilized society. Historical records describe how the sack, called the cullius, was sometimes weighted with stones or metal to ensure no chance of survival, turning the river or sea into a communal tomb. The public spectacle of the sentencing amplified its impact, serving as a visceral warning against the unthinkable crime of destroying one's own family. Yet beneath the horror lies a paradox. Rome, a society that celebrated legal precision and civic virtue, also sanctioned punishment steeped in primal symbolism. The same courts that debated property disputes and contracts could prescribe a penalty that felt ripped from myth. This duality forces us to confront how even advanced civilizations rationalized brutality when emotions ran high. Modern scholars note that Pona Cullae was rarely carried out, reserved for only the most egregious cases, which raises questions about its true purpose. Was it a genuine deterrent or a symbolic gesture to reassure society that certain boundaries could never be crossed? The legacy of Pona Cullae lingers in legal philosophy. Its emphasis on fitting the punishment to the crime echoes in debates about proportional justice today, but its brutality also reminds us how easily symbolism can tip into savagery. As we move forward, consider how another punishment weaponized public shame, not with animals or drowning, but through a device that turned everyday objects into instruments of torment. The Stocks and Pillories didn't just punish the body, they shattered reputations, proving that in some eras, social death could be as feared as physical execution. The pillory turned punishment into a public sport where the crowd became both jury and executioner. Strapped into a wooden frame with their head and hands locked in place, victims were left utterly defenseless, not just against the elements, but against the whims of anyone passing by. Some received mere taunts or handfuls of dirt, while others faced a hailstorm of stones, dead animals, or boiling liquids until their sentence ended in unconsciousness or death. Judges knew the risk when they imposed this penalty, counting on the mob's fury to amplify the court's verdict without official blood on their hands. What made the pillory uniquely terrifying was its unpredictability. Unlike the scaffold or the rack, where suffering was measured and controlled, the pillory handed power to the crowd. A minor offender might emerge unharmed after an hour of jeers, while a despised tax collector could be battered to death in minutes. Historical records describe how bystanders sometimes intervened to protect the restrained, offering water or sheltering them from projectiles. But just as often, collective rage took over. The line between judicial humiliation and unofficial execution blurred entirely in cases like that of London's Edward Bird, who perished in 1720 after 3 days of relentless stoning for perjury. This practice exposes a dark truth about communal justice. When societies outsource punishment to the public, they unleash forces far beyond the law's intent. The pillory wasn't just about shaming individuals, it tested a community's capacity for mercy or cruelty. Towns that tolerated fatal violence during these spectacles often saw escalating mob rule elsewhere, proving that state-sanctioned vulnerability could erode social order rather than reinforce it. Even the physical design of the pillory played a role. Positioned in market squares or crossroads, it ensured maximum visibility, turning every passerby into a potential participant in the condemned's fate. Yet the pillory's legacy isn't purely grim. Its gradual abolition in the 19th century marked a turning point, as reformers argued that justice should degrade neither the punished nor those who watched. Modern parallels exist in viral online shaming, where digital mobs mete out unchecked retribution. The pillories rise and fall remind us that when punishment becomes entertainment, society pays a price far steeper than the victim's suffering. Now consider a punishment that weaponized fire, not for swift execution but for a prolonged illusion of mercy. Where the pillory let crowds dictate the outcome, the next method promised agonizing salvation, trapping victims between flames and false hope. Burning at the stake wasn't just an execution, it was a gruesome performance with a twisted spiritual justification. Judges and clergy framed the flames as a cleansing force, claiming fire purified the soul even as it blackened the flesh. Victims, often accused of heresy or witchcraft, were tied to a post atop a pyre, sometimes given a pouch of gunpowder to hasten death as a supposed act of mercy. But the reality was far crueler. Fires were carefully controlled to burn slowly, prolonging suffering as smoke filled the lungs and flames licked upward. The screams of the condemned weren't incidental, they were part of the spectacle, a visceral reminder of the cost of defiance. What made this punishment uniquely horrifying was its dual purpose. Beyond physical agony, it served as propaganda. Crowds gathered not just to witness justice, but to participate in a collective ritual reinforcing religious and political power. In 16th century Europe, stakes burned across town squares like grim warning beacons, their light visible for miles. The smell of charred flesh lingered for days, a sensory reminder of the consequences of dissent. Historical records describe how some victims, like Joan of Arc, became symbols of resistance precisely because their deaths were so public, turning state-sanctioned murder into martyrdom. The psychology behind burning reveals deeper societal fears. Fire symbolized divine wrath in many cultures, making it the perfect tool for punishing those accused of supernatural crimes. Yet the practice also exposed hypocrisy. While authorities claimed moral high ground, their methods often relied on coerced confessions and mass hysteria. Modern forensic studies suggest many victims lost consciousness from smoke inhalation before flames reached them, but the terror of awaiting that moment, the heat intensifying, the crowd's roar drowning out final prayers, was its own torture. This punishment's legacy lingers in unsettling ways. Today, burning evokes witch trials where evidence was non-existent and bias ruled. But its echoes persist whenever societies scapegoat marginalized groups, trading justice for spectacle. As we turn to punishments that dismantled the body piece by piece, remember how easily fear can fuel cruelty, and how public suffering has been used not just to punish, but to control. The breaking wheel took dismemberment to chilling new heights, transforming execution into a prolonged mechanical process. Reserved for thieves and murderers in medieval Europe, victims were tied to a large wooden wheel while an executioner methodically shattered their limbs with an iron bar. The sequence mattered, starting with legs to prolong consciousness, arms next, then finally a fatal blow to the chest called the coup de grace. But some judges ordered the grand coup, leaving the broken body atop the wheel for birds to scavenge, a grotesque public display that could last days. What set the wheel apart was its clinical precision. Unlike the chaotic violence of burning, this punishment followed a grim script, each strike calculated to maximize suffering without immediate death. The crunch of bone and screams of the condemned served as auditory warnings to onlookers. Some regions added refinements like rotating the wheel between blows to distribute pain evenly, showcasing a perverse innovation in cruelty. Accounts from 18th century Germany describe wheels left near highways as deterrents, their grisly cargo visible to travelers for weeks. Yet the wheel also reveals a paradox in medieval justice. The same societies that produced stunning cathedrals and legal codes saw no contradiction in such brutality. Its use peaked during periods of social unrest, suggesting authorities relied on extreme visual punishments when they felt control slipping. Modern reconstructions using medical knowledge reveal the horror. Compound fractures would send bone shards into muscle tissue, while shock and infection ensured prolonged agony for those denied a quick end. As we reflect on these punishments, a pattern emerges: the more a society feared disorder, the more inventive its cruelty became. The wheel didn't just break bodies, it sought to break spirits, using mechanical repetition to strip away humanity itself. Its eventual abolition came not from sudden enlightenment, but from gradual realization. Perhaps justice shouldn't resemble the crimes it punished. Now consider a punishment that inverted this logic entirely, where survival, not death, became the ultimate sentence. Abandonment in the wilderness or at sea forced victims to confront isolation and nature's indifference, proving sometimes the harshest sentences involved no executioner at all. Lingchi, known as death by 1,000 cuts, was a punishment so methodical in its cruelty that it turned execution into a gruesome art form. Reserved for crimes like treason or patricide in Imperial China, this practice wasn't just about killing, it was a chilling demonstration of the state's absolute authority over life and death. Victims were tied to a wooden frame while executioners, often highly skilled in anatomy, made precise incisions to prolong suffering without causing immediate fatality. Historical accounts describe how the process could stretch for hours, with some victims receiving hundreds of shallow cuts before the final, fatal stroke. The meticulousness of the technique was no accident. It ensured maximum psychological terror as the condemned watched their own bodies being dismantled piece by piece. What set Lingchi apart from other brutal punishments was its theatrical precision. Crowds gathered to witness the spectacle, but unlike the chaos of burning or the frenzy of Damnatio ad Bestias, this was a slow, almost ritualistic unraveling of life. The cuts followed a specific sequence, starting with non-lethal areas like the limbs, then progressing to more sensitive regions, each slice deepening the victim's agony while maintaining consciousness. Some records suggest opium was administered not as mercy, but to keep the condemned lucid enough to feel every wound. The message was clear: defiance against the state would be met with pain so calculated it bordered on ceremonial. Yet Lingchi also reveals a paradox in Imperial China's legal philosophy. The same civilization that gave us Confucian ideals of harmony and benevolence also perfected this extreme form of retribution. Scholars argue that its purpose went beyond deterrence. It was a symbolic erasure of the criminal's very existence, as dismemberment was believed to prevent a peaceful afterlife. This duality forces us to confront how even advanced societies can compartmentalize cruelty, justifying it as necessary for order. By the 19th century, Western observers documented Lingchi with horrified fascination, their accounts fueling debates about the boundaries of justice and human rights. The legacy of Lingchi lingers in modern discussions about punishment and power. Its abolition in the early 20th century marked a turning point, but its memory serves as a grim reminder of how easily authority can tip into atrocity. As we shift focus to another method of execution, consider how the weight of stones replaced the precision of blades, a punishment that traded slow cuts for crushing force, proving that the imagination of ancient judges knew no limits when it came to inflicting suffering. Pressing to death, or peine forte et dure, turned the simple act of breathing into an impossible feat. Unlike swift executions, this medieval punishment stretched suffering over hours, sometimes days, as weights piled higher on a victim's chest with each passing moment. The process was chillingly methodical. Defendants who refused to enter pleas would be stripped naked, bound to the ground, and slowly crushed beneath slabs of stone. their ribs cracking under the inexorable pressure until their lungs could no longer expand. What makes this punishment particularly unsettling isn't just the physical torment, but its psychological cruelty. Judges weaponized silence itself, offering the condemned a choice: speak and face trial, or endure a torturous death for refusing to acknowledge the court's authority. Historical records reveal the grim pragmatism behind peine forte et dure. In an era when legal confessions carried immense weight, authorities couldn't proceed with trials if defendants remained mute. Rather than respecting their right to silence, the justice system devised a way to break their will through sheer, suffocating force. Some accounts describe how executioners would place a sharp stone beneath the victim's back to intensify the pain, ensuring every labored breath became a battle against piercing agony. The punishment's name, French for hard and forceful punishment, betrays its origins in Norman law, but its use spread to England and beyond, becoming a tool to assert judicial dominance. Yet this method also exposed a paradox in medieval justice. While courts claimed to seek truth, they often prioritized compliance over fairness. Victims who chose pressing over pleading weren't necessarily guilty. They might have been protecting loved ones from property forfeiture, as convictions could strip families of their livelihoods. Others may have simply lacked faith in a system they knew was stacked against them. The slow, public nature of the punishment served as theater, warning onlookers of the cost of defiance. Modern forensic studies suggest death would come from a combination of asphyxiation and circulatory collapse, but the mind's torment knowing each weight added brought death closer was its own form of torture. The abolition of peine forte et dure in the 18th century marked a shift toward recognizing the brutality of coerced confessions. Its legacy lingers in debates about judicial pressure tactics, from harsh interrogations to the psychological weight of solitary confinement. As we transition to the next punishment, consider how societies weaponized even the act of burial. Where pressing used gravity to crush life away, live entombment exploited the primal terror of being buried alive, a fate that turned the earth itself into an executioner. Immurement turned walls into silent executioners, sealing victims away from light, sound, and hope. Unlike quick executions, this punishment stretched suffering over days as the condemned slowly succumbed to thirst, hunger, or suffocation in airless chambers. Ancient judges reserved it for crimes like sacrilege or treason, where the symbolism mattered as much as the sentence. Being entombed alive mirrored the spiritual death of excommunication, cutting offenders off from the living world as completely as if they'd already perished. The terror wasn't just in the physical ordeal, it was the psychological torment of knowing rescue might be inches away, yet entirely out of reach. Archaeological evidence reveals how carefully designed these tombs could be. Some were narrow niches in monastery walls, barely wider than a human body, while others were elaborate oubliettes underground dungeons with ceilings lowered brick by brick to prolong the victim's awareness of their fate. Historical accounts describe how some immured prisoners were given symbolic last meals like bread and water, a cruel gesture that only delayed the inevitable. The practice peaked during the Middle Ages, when religious institutions used it to punish clergy who violated vows, turning sacred architecture into instruments of suffering. What makes immurement uniquely haunting is its passive brutality. Unlike flaying or burning, no executioner needed to witness the final moments. The state or church could claim plausible deniability, as if the walls themselves had delivered justice. Modern forensic studies of discovered immurement sites show how victims often scratched at stone or wood until their fingers bled, leaving behind ghostly traces of their desperation. This punishment's legacy lingers in language. Phrases like walled up or left to rot echo its visceral horror. Yet immurement also exposes a paradox in ancient justice systems. The same societies that built soaring cathedrals and libraries also designed punishments that weaponized isolation, proving that progress and cruelty could coexist. As we turn to the next method, consider how judges traded darkness for blinding light, a punishment that claimed to offer mercy while leaving victims permanently severed from the world's beauty. Where immurement erased freedom, blinding sought to distort reality itself, proving that some sentences were far worse than death. Blinding wasn't just about removing sight, it was the deliberate erasure of autonomy, a living death for those who dared challenge power. In Byzantine courts and medieval kingdoms, judges favored this punishment for political rivals, viewing it as a merciful alternative to execution that still guaranteed the victim could never rule or rebel again. The process itself was a calculated horror. Hot irons or sharp blades would sear or scoop out the eyes, sometimes leaving empty sockets, other times sealing them with molten metal to prevent healing. But what authorities called mercy often became a slower death sentence, as infections from the crude surgeries ravaged the body or the newly blinded succumbed to accidents, unable to navigate their darkened world. The symbolism behind blinding cuts deeper than the physical act. In an era when leaders were expected to project strength and divine favor, disfigurement rendered them unfit to govern, a walking reminder of their defeat. Byzantine Emperor Basil II famously blinded 15,000 Bulgarian prisoners after a battle, leaving one man in every 100 with a single eye to lead the others home. This wasn't just cruelty, it was psychological warfare, a message carved into flesh that resistance meant becoming a burden rather than a martyr. Historical accounts describe how blinded nobles were sometimes paraded through cities, their broken faces proof of the regime's absolute control. Yet the practice exposes a paradox in medieval justice. While societies valued honor and appearance, they also embraced punishments that created permanent spectacles of suffering. Blindness carried spiritual weight too. Many believed the mutilated couldn't enter heaven whole, adding eternal consequences to earthly punishment. Modern ophthalmology reveals the medical horrors victims faced: severed optic nerves, gangrene from unclean tools, and the relentless pain of healing without proper care. Some blinded individuals, like the Anglo-Saxon King Ethelred the Unready's half-brother Edward, became living warnings, their presence a deterrent long after their political influence had been extinguished. As we shift from the brutality of blinding, consider how everyday objects could be twisted into tools of torment. Where eyes were prized and power flowed through vision, the next punishment weaponized something far simpler. The chair, an ordinary piece of furniture transformed into an engine of unbearable suffering. The Judas Cradle awaited those who survived blinding but still had secrets to surrender, proving that in the hands of inventive judges, nothing was too mundane to become an instrument of agony. The breaking wheel turned human bodies into shattered mosaics of bone and sinew, a punishment so methodical in its cruelty that even veteran executioners approached it with grim precision. Reserved for crimes like highway robbery and murder across medieval Europe, this device wasn't just a tool of death, it was a carefully choreographed spectacle of suffering. Victims were lashed to a large wooden wheel, their limbs strategically positioned over the spokes as an executioner delivered calculated blows with an iron bar. The sequence was deliberate: legs first to prevent standing, then arms to eliminate resistance, and finally the chest, though some judges ordered the grand coup, leaving the condemned to linger for days atop the wheel, exposed to scavengers and the elements. What set the wheel apart was its theatrical duality. On one hand, it served as a visceral deterrent: broken bodies displayed at crossroads warned travelers of the price of lawlessness. On the other, it revealed a perverse innovation in judicial torture. Unlike the chaos of burning or the swiftness of beheading, the wheel's agony unfolded in stages, each crack of bone audible to onlookers. Historical records from Germany describe how some victims survived for up to 3 days after their limbs were shattered, their moans carrying across fields as a macabre reminder of authorities' reach. The wheel's design even accounted for efficiency. Rotating it between strikes distributed pain evenly, ensuring no single injury brought merciful unconsciousness too soon. Yet the breaking wheel also exposed a paradox in medieval justice. The same societies that produced illuminated manuscripts and soaring cathedrals saw no contradiction in perfecting such brutality. Its use peaked during times of social upheaval, suggesting rulers relied on extreme visual punishments when their grip on power felt tenuous. Modern forensic analysis reveals the physiological horror. Compound fractures would drive bone shards into muscle tissue, while shock and infection turned the body against itself. But perhaps the most chilling detail was the psychological torment victims knew the wheel's reputation. Waiting in cells for days or weeks as the device was constructed, their imaginations compounding the coming agony. As we leave the wheel behind, consider how another punishment weaponized nature's most reviled creatures. Where the breaking wheel relied on cold mechanics, the next method harnessed the primal terror of being devoured from within, a fate where the executioners were not men, but rats driven mad by hunger and heat. The transition from splintered bones to gnawing teeth reveals how inventive cruelty could be when fear, not justice, was the true goal. Rat torture weaponized one of humanity's oldest fears, the horror of being eaten alive, and turned it into a calculated science of suffering. Unlike blunt instruments or blades, this method used living creatures as executioners, exploiting their desperate instincts to inflict unimaginable agony. Victims were strapped to tables as metal cages containing starving rats were fastened to their bare torsos. Then came the true cruelty. Executioners would heat the cages with coals or torches, driving the panicked animals to claw and chew their only escape route straight through the victim's abdomen. Historical accounts describe how the rats, frantic from the heat, would tunnel into soft tissue, their sharp teeth and claws shredding organs while the victim remained fully conscious. Some interrogators prolonged the process by alternating heat and cooling, giving false hope between waves of torment. What made this punishment uniquely terrifying wasn't just the physical violation, but the psychological dread of anticipation. Unlike a swift blade or noose, rat torture stretched suffering over hours, each moment filled with the sound of scratching claws and the growing warmth of the metal. Judges favored it for extracting confessions precisely because it broke wills through sustained terror rather than immediate pain. The Spanish Inquisition reportedly used variations of this method during heresy trials, recognizing that the mind's fear of what was coming often proved more powerful than the act itself. Modern forensic analysis suggests many victims died from shock or peritonitis long before the rats reached vital organs, their bodies giving out from the sheer trauma of the invasion. This method also reveals how deeply ancient interrogators understood primal fears. While other punishments targeted the body, rat torture preyed on an instinctive revulsion hardwired into human psychology. The idea of small creatures burrowing inside us triggers a visceral panic that transcends culture or era. Some executioners amplified this by choosing black rats, species associated with plague and filth, adding layers of symbolic horror to the physical torment. Yet there's a grim irony here. The same societies that developed advanced medicine and anatomy also perfected ways to weaponize life itself against the living. As we turn from the horror of teeth and claws, consider how water, something essential for survival, could be perverted into an instrument of chance. Where rat torture relied on creatures driven by instinct, the next punishment introduced an element of cruel randomness, proving that in the hands of inventive judges, even drowning could become a sadistic game. Trial by water turned judgment into a perverse game of chance, where the laws of physics became executioners. Accused witches faced an impossible choice, bound hand and foot. They were tossed into rivers or ponds with a grim ultimatum. If they floated, it proved their guilt, as water supposedly rejected the unholy. But if they sank, it signaled innocence, though few survived to celebrate their vindication. This medieval ordeal weaponized nature itself, allowing judges to cloak brutality in the guise of divine intervention. The lose-lose scenario exposed how superstition corrupted justice, transforming courts into theaters where survival was statistically impossible. Historical records from the European witch trials reveal the chilling pragmatism behind this practice. Bodies of water were carefully selected, deep enough to drown, yet shallow enough to prolong the struggle. Some accounts describe victims being tied with special knots that tightened when wet, ensuring even strong swimmers couldn't escape. The public spectacle served dual purposes. It entertained crowds while reinforcing religious authority. In 17th century England, the infamous Pendle witch trials saw elderly women subjected to these tests, their fates sealed not by evidence, but by whether their lungs filled with water before their bodies breached the surface. What makes trial by water particularly insidious is its illusion of fairness. By attributing outcomes to God's will, authorities absolved themselves of blame. Modern physics explains the grim reality: a person's buoyancy depends on factors like lung capacity and body composition, not supernatural forces. Yet for centuries, this pseudoscience condemned thousands. The same communities that prized rational thought in medicine or astronomy embraced magical thinking when it came to punishing marginalized groups, especially women who defied social norms. The legacy of these ordeals lingers in language. Phrases like witch hunt still describe baseless persecution. As we transition to another liquid-based punishment, consider how water's life-giving properties could be inverted. Where trial by water used immersion as a test, the next method forced victims to consume their way to oblivion, a punishment where the very act of drinking became a slow march toward death. Drinking molten metal transformed justice into a perverse alchemy, where stolen treasure became the instrument of a thief's demise. In ancient Mesopotamia, judges didn't just sentence criminals, they orchestrated a fatal symmetry, forcing thieves to swallow the very metals they'd coveted. Boiling gold or lead would be poured down the condemned's throat, searing flesh and organs in a cruel parody of consumption. This wasn't merely execution, it was poetic retribution, a literal embodiment of "you are what you steal." The punishment's theatricality amplified its message, as the victim's agonized cries underscored the futility of ill-gotten gains. The symbolism ran deeper than mere irony. Precious metals held divine significance in these cultures. Gold symbolized the sun's purity in Mesopotamia, while lead represented earthly corruption in India. By using them as tools of execution, judges implied the thief had violated cosmic order, not just human law. Historical texts like the Code of Hammurabi describe this penalty for temple robbers, suggesting it served as both punishment and ritual purification. Modern forensic analysis reveals the horrifying physiology. Molten metal would instantly cauterize the esophagus while boiling internal tissues, ensuring death came not from blood loss but from systemic shock and organ failure. Yet this method also exposes a paradox in ancient legal philosophy. The same societies that pioneered early mathematics and astronomy also crafted punishments where symbolism outweighed practicality. Pouring molten metal required skilled executioners to avoid premature death. Some accounts describe using funnels to prolong the process, turning a swift sentence into drawn-out torment. The public spectacle reinforced hierarchy, demonstrating how power could transform wealth into a weapon. As we shift from fire to water, consider how the sea itself became an execution chamber. Where molten metal punished greed with searing finality, the next method weaponized the ocean's vast indifference, a fate where victims weren't just killed by nature, but forced to confront its merciless scale. Sailors who mutinied or committed sacrilege faced being cast adrift in open boats, left to the whims of waves and thirst. The horror wasn't in the act itself, but in the days of anticipation as the shoreline vanished, leaving only the endless horizon as a judge and jury. Keelhauling turned the ocean itself into an executioner, a punishment so brutal it haunted sailors' nightmares for centuries. Picture a convicted crew member tied to a rope that ran beneath the ship's hull, then dragged underwater from one side to the other, a journey that could last minutes if the vessel was large enough. The victim faced a horrifying duality, drowning if the drag was slow, or being shredded by the barnacles encrusting the hull if it was swift. Naval judges prized this method not just for its lethality, but for its theatrical impact. Crews would line the rails, forced to watch as their shipmate emerged either lifeless or flayed to the bone, the seawater around the hull staining crimson. The mechanics of keelhauling reveal its calculated cruelty. Ships accumulated razor-sharp barnacles and marine growth during long voyages, transforming their hulls into natural instruments of torture. Executioners could adjust the speed of the haul to control the punishment's severity. Some accounts describe victims dragged so slowly they convulsed from oxygen deprivation before reaching the surface. Dutch naval logs from the 17th century note how captains would sometimes order multiple passes, ensuring no patch of skin escaped the barnacle's serrated edges. The punishment's name itself derived from the Dutch keelhalen, meaning to haul under the keel, betrays its origins as a disciplinary tool in Europe's most formidable navies. What made keelhauling uniquely terrifying was its psychological dimension. Unlike private executions, this was a public ritual reinforcing the chain of command. Every sailor knew that insubordination or theft could leave them facing the hull's jagged embrace. The punishment also exploited maritime superstitions. Many believed a keel-hauled corpse carried bad luck, its spirit doomed to haunt the ship. Modern forensic analysis suggests few survived the ordeal. Those who did often succumbed to infections from the deep lacerations or lung damage from inhaled seawater. Yet the threat alone was enough to maintain order on long voyages where mutiny lurked in every discontented whisper. This practice exposes the stark reality of maritime justice. In an era when ships were floating kingdoms, captains wielded absolute power, and punishments had to deter rebellion in confined spaces far from shore. The same navies that mapped the globe and advanced naval technology also perfected this barbaric method, proving progress in one area doesn't guarantee humanity in another. As we shift from the ocean's brutality to dry land, consider how the next punishment weaponized something far simpler, a common chair transformed into an engine of torment. Where keelhauling used nature's cruelty, the Judas Cradle would demonstrate mankind's capacity for inventiveness in suffering. Ear cropping turned the human body into a living billboard of shame, a punishment where justice wasn't just served, it was permanently displayed. Colonial judges in America and Europe wielded knives not only to inflict pain but to carve a criminal story into their very flesh. Petty thieves, forgers, and repeat offenders faced the blade, their ears severed in public spectacles designed to brand them for life. The message was clear: society would remember your crimes even if you tried to reform. Unlike temporary punishments like the stocks, ear cropping left an indelible mark, ensuring every handshake, every glance in the mirror, and every sideways look from neighbors reinforced the weight of past transgressions. The brutality of this practice lay in its precision. Executioners weren't haphazard. They made clean cuts to maximize visibility while minimizing infection risk, ensuring the victim survived as a walking cautionary tale. Historical court records from Puritan Massachusetts describe how cropped ears became shorthand for untrustworthiness, barring individuals from certain trades or even church membership. In England, the punishment peaked during the Tudor era, when vagrancy laws targeted the poor with escalating mutilations, first an ear, then the second for repeat offenses. The mutilation wasn't just physical, it was social exile, a way to isolate the condemned without the expense of imprisonment. What made ear cropping uniquely insidious was its psychological permanence. A stolen purse or forged document might fade from memory, but the absence of an ear turned every interaction into a reminder of shame. Some victims, like the English highwayman John Rann, flaunted their scars as badges of defiance, while others hid beneath wigs or head coverings, desperate to blend back into society. Modern parallels exist in branding or tattoo removal, visible marks that carry stigma long after sentences are served. Yet the practice also reveals a paradox in colonial justice. The same communities that prized redemption and religious forgiveness embraced punishments that made reintegration nearly impossible. As we transition from the silent stigma of missing ears to the roaring chaos of animal executions, consider how societies escalated from marking bodies to obliterating them. Where ear cropping whispered shame, the next punishment roared it, a grotesque spectacle where beasts became both executioners and metaphors, tearing apart the condemned in ways that left no body to bury. The shift from symbolic mutilation to total annihilation speaks volumes about how fear, not justice, often dictated the harshest sentences. Crushing by elephant turned execution into a grand spectacle of raw power, where the very ground trembled under the weight of royal justice. Across ancient South and Southeast Asia, trained pachyderms served as both executioners and symbols, their massive feet delivering sentences with crushing finality. Kings and judges favored this method not just for its lethality, but for its visceral impact on crowds. Imagine the scene: a condemned prisoner forced to kneel as a multi-ton beast raised its foot overhead, the delayed impact stretching the terror into unbearable seconds. The message was unmistakable: defy the ruler, and even nature's mightiest creatures would become instruments of your demise. What set this punishment apart was its calculated blend of brutality and pageantry. Elephants held sacred status in many Asian cultures, embodying wisdom and divine authority. By weaponizing these revered animals, rulers demonstrated that their will superseded even cosmic order. Historical records from India's Mughal courts describe how elephants were meticulously trained for the task, some taught to prolong suffering with gradual pressure, others to dismember limbs with precise tusk movements. The animals' ornate trappings, golden harnesses, jeweled headpieces turned executions into macabre ceremonies where death arrived draped in splendor. The psychology behind elephant executions reveals deeper societal structures. Unlike hidden dungeon tortures, these public spectacles reinforced hierarchy through shared witness. A single crushing could deter hundreds, as the memory of splintering bones and muffled screams lingered in the collective consciousness. Some accounts suggest victims were sometimes given last-minute reprieves, heightening the theater of capricious power. Modern animal behavior studies shed light on the training methods. Elephants likely associated the condemned with specific commands rather than understanding the moral weight of their actions. making them unwitting participants in state terror. As we reflect on these 21 punishments, a pattern emerges. The more a society feared disorder, the more creative its cruelty became. Ancient judges didn't just punish crimes, they weaponized fear itself, using pain as propaganda. Yet buried in this grim history is an unexpected parallel. Today's justice systems still balance deterrence and morality, though the tools have changed dramatically. Where elephants once crushed bodies, now algorithms calculate sentences, proof that humanity's quest for order endures, even as our methods evolve. The true measure of progress lies not in what we punish, but how we choose to remember these dark chapters. Looking back at these ancient punishments, it's striking how far justice systems have evolved, not just in methods but in philosophy. Where judges once measured their power by the intensity of suffering inflicted, modern courts now weigh rehabilitation, fairness, and even the potential for redemption. Consider the contrast. A medieval thief might lose a hand to the executioner's axe, while today, that same crime could lead to community service or counseling. This shift isn't just about softer sentences. It reflects a fundamental rethinking of what justice should achieve. Societies once believed terror was the ultimate deterrent, but history shows cruelty often bred resentment, not order. Yet the debate over punishment's purpose still echoes today. Some argue that harsh penalties like Singapore's caning for vandalism or strict drug laws prove effective in maintaining social order. But the key difference lies in intent. Ancient punishments weren't just about preventing crime. They were performances of dominance designed to break spirits as much as bodies. Modern systems, even at their strictest, aim for proportionality, punishment fitting the crime, not exceeding it for theatrical effect. The abolition of torture in most legal codes didn't happen out of sudden kindness. It came from recognizing that brutality undermines the very legitimacy it claims to uphold. What's most revealing is how punishment mirrors a society's values. The Breaking Wheel and Brazen Bull flourished in eras where authority was unquestioned and human life held little inherent value. Today, even maximum security prisons operate under frameworks like the UN's standard minimum rules, which forbid cruel or degrading treatment. This progress wasn't inevitable. It was fought for by reformers who saw justice as a system that should elevate, not obliterate. The rise of restorative justice programs where offenders face victims and make amends shows how accountability can coexist with empathy, but the shadows of the past linger. Public executions may be rare, but viral shaming and sensationalized trials reveal our lingering appetite for spectacle. The question isn't just how we punish, but why. Do we seek order, revenge, or transformation? As we close this exploration, consider this. If future generations look back at our prisons, fines, and community service, what will it tell them about who we were? The measure of a society isn't in how it treats its most privileged, but in how it judges its most vulnerable. The arc of justice may bend slowly, but each step away from cruelty is a step toward a system worthy of the name. From the Brazen Bull's agonizing roars to the elephant's crushing weight, these 21 punishments expose humanity's capacity for inventiveness in cruelty. But beyond the shock value lies a deeper question. What do these brutal methods truly reveal about the societies that created them? Each punishment wasn't just about inflicting pain. It was a mirror reflecting cultural fears, political priorities, and the fragile line between order and oppression. The Roman Empire's crucifixions reinforced imperial power. Medieval Europe's breaking wheels maintained feudal hierarchy, and Persia's boat executions weaponized nature itself, all under the guise of justice. This grim tour through history forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. The same civilizations that gave us philosophy, art, and democratic ideals also devised punishments where creativity served cruelty. Ancient Athens, birthplace of democracy, used the Brazen Bull. Renaissance Europe, hub of enlightenment, perfected the Judas Cradle. Progress in one area never guarantees humanity in another, a lesson that resonates today as we debate modern justice systems. While we've abandoned molten metal and flaying knives, elements of performative punishment persist in public shaming or harsh sentencing laws designed more for political spectacle than public safety. Yet there's hope in this dark history. The abolition of these methods didn't happen overnight. It required centuries of reformers challenging the notion that terror equaled justice. Figures like Cesare Beccaria, whose 18th century writings condemned torture, planted seeds for systems prioritizing rehabilitation over retribution. Modern forensic science proves what ancient rulers ignored. Extreme pain clouds truth rather than reveals it, and humane systems ultimately foster greater social stability. So where does this leave us? These punishments serve as stark reminders, not of how backward our ancestors were, but of how easily power can corrupt justice when left unchecked. The next time you hear someone argue for harsher penalties or applaud brutal interrogations in movies, remember the Brazen Bull's legacy. True justice shouldn't require broken bones or seared flesh to prove its worth. If history teaches us anything, it's that the measure of a society isn't in how it treats its heroes, but in how it judges its accused. What do you think? Could any context ever justify such methods, or do they belong solely in history's darkest chapters? Share your perspective below, and if you found this exploration revealing, join us for more journeys into history's untold stories. The past may be set in stone, but how we learn from it is still being written. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell, because understanding where we've been is the first step toward deciding where we're going. Thanks for watching, and remember, progress isn't inevitable, but with knowledge and empathy, it's always possible.